So have you taught Bollywood?
I have taught Bollywood. This was very much incorporated in my dance class. For the 5 years that I taught, I had two classes, a beginners and an intermediate stroke advanced, because obviously after a couple of years, the intermediate students were quite good, and in fact they couldn't quite fairly be called intermediate students anymore. And what I used to do was give them a very sort of tough 3 weeks of the 4 weeks in a month of Kathak lessons. And then every sort of last lesson of every month, they would have a sort of relief from that, and they'd have a little mixture of some Bollywood, some folk, whether it's Bengali or Hindi or Punjabi, and also some other types of variety of music, whether it's French, because I was learning French at that time, so I introduced French music into the class. So just so that they can understand that, you know, music is so versatile, so universal, and so that they wouldn't sort of get bogged down in just doing Kathak. Because often I would hear from their conversations of what they were talking to their other friends about Kathak, and they would say, no, we learn Kathak, and this is a special type of Indian dance. And so to make them understand that actually it can relate to other types of dance, and it doesn't mean that it has to be in this sort of glass box and has no relation with anything else.
Who were the French artists that you used?
The French artists I used were more sort of Edith Piaf, and also little sections from my favorite ballet performances. For example, one of my favorite ballets is La Fille Mal Gardée, very comical, because obviously some of the ballet performances are quite serious, and it sort of takes away the whole point of giving them a bit of light relief. But a typical example of La Fille Mal Gardée is about this very naughty girl, farmhouse girl, having a romance, a surreptitious romance with another farm boy. But her mother has much higher hopes for her and wants her to marry the local village landlord's son. So this sort of storytelling really, really engaged them, because the whole idea of Kathak, the word Kathak, comes from the word Katha, which means to storytell. So that has a bearing on anything they do in life. You know, even if they have a little incident in their playground, there's a story behind that. So very much in ballet, or whether it's Kathak, or whether it's a little devotional piece, or whether it's a pop song or a French nursery rhyme, there's a story behind that. So that was my intention all the time, to try and get them to engage, to try and get them to be curious. And if they're watching something like a little small puppet show or just a bit of pantomime, to understand that it's not just what they're seeing, but there's something always behind what they're seeing.
So would you say that transferred to Bollywood dancing as well, because in Bollywood a song or a dance would carry the story forward?
Yes, the storytelling of the Kathak transfers to Bollywood very well, because Bollywood is all about social lessons and giving people a little bit of light relief, fantasy, as well as giving people a resolution at the end of a conflict. And so even though perhaps to an outsider that seems rather a predictable formula, I don't believe it is, because every single film has something at its core which is very unique to that particular film. What it has in common is that those social lessons are always there, so that in a country where the population is 1 billion, it is often very, very easy to sort of forget the less privileged and the less advantaged. And so these films have a very, very big message in sending to the sort of general public, that, you know, don't forget the average Joe, because everyone has something very, very special about them. And I think that helps in a class when young kids are learning a particular type of dance which is classical and rather rarefied, and gives them a sort of heightened sense of importance, that when they're having to actually deal with Bollywood dancing, they realize that Bollywood dancing isn't about being in a rarefied atmosphere. It's about making something which is rarefied, public and accessible and equal for everyone.
How would you describe Bollywood dancing?
Well, I would describe it as the most wonderful melange. I would describe Bollywood dancing as the most wonderful melange of rainbow colors. It has everything in it. It has Odissi, it has Bharatanatyam, it has Kathak, it has folk, it has sometimes even a little bit of, well, especially Michael Jackson. He's a big source of inspiration to the young heroes of the day, really. So I think Bollywood dancing is the best of all cultures put together in a very small melting pot, and what comes out is magic.
When you say very small melting pot, what do you mean?
The melting pot I was referring to being small is because Bollywood itself is very much still a money-making machine. They have got their sort of esoteric ideas, but at the end of the day, they need to make sure that the box office hits are there. So each film needs to hit a certain amount of markers. And so when I talk about small melting pot, I'm talking about those top directors. For example, Sanjay Leela Bhansali being an example. You know, making a film like Devdas, which has all of those old traditional values, but at the same time, he's got all of those typical markers which make it sellable in this day and age, because otherwise you can imagine India being a very forward-looking country, very IT-orientated country. Why would people go in their droves to watch a film like Devdas? Because a director like Sanjay Leela Bhansali has managed to put just the right amount of old and the right amount of pizzazz and new to make it this sort of wonderful kind of combustion, you know, which makes people salivate when a new film comes out. You know, they just can't wait for the opening date to go and see.
When you say markers, do you mean dance-wise, musical-wise, camera-wise, modern technique-wise? What kind of, as in dance technique markers, or I mean, what do you mean?
The markers I'm talking about, for example, of a director, in this case, I'll use the example of Sanjay Leela Bhansali, is that he is very, very good on his research. He will research the costume, and that will be absolutely perfect to a T. Then he'll probably get in costume designers to use that as a background and then work from that. For example, when Aishwarya Rai is running down to meet her childhood friend and actually doesn't manage it. Her archel, instead of being 2 yards long, because the sari is 6 yards, the archel should be 2 yards, it looks like the archel is in fact 20 yards long. That's a typical example of something that is embedded in somebody's mind. If a child is watching that film, that kind of directorial marker will be embedded in that child's mind. That's just one example. Obviously the music, for example, musical directorial involvement from someone like A.R. Rahman has a huge impact on Indian music and film. And now what's happening is A.R. Rahman has somehow surpassed India, come through to London and the West End, and on his way to sort of US and global. Why is that? Because the directors who've actually agreed to use A.R. Rahman to begin with knew that his classical background would be amazing in the films, but also knew that his ability to orchestrate the sound would make it marketable. And that marketability is what makes Bollywood a small melting pot, because you need to have lots of strings to your bows to be one of the top guns in Bollywood.